Welcome to Hub History, the show where we share our favorite stories from Boston history. This is episode 99, Boston's Wild West. Hi, I'm Nikki.
And I'm Jake. This week, we're going to discuss one of Boston's westernmost neighborhoods. Today, Brighton's mostly associated with Boston's large and sometimes unruly student population. But in the mid-19th century, Brighton was home to all the elements of a Western movie. There were cattle drives, stockyards, saloons, and stampedes through the streets. Before it was tamed, unruly Brighton was our own Wild West. But before we talk about Boston's Wild West, it's time to take a look at this week's featured historic site and upcoming event.
This week's featured historic site is an unassuming building on a street corner in Brighton. Today, it's home to a custard shop, a barber, and a tailor. Only a small green historical marker on the corner of the building marks it as the former home of Brighton Agricultural Hall, which historian William Marchione describes as one of the community's oldest and most historic buildings. It now stands at the corner of Washington Street and Chestnut Hill Avenue, but in 1818, the Agricultural Hall was built on top of a hill a few blocks away, where Winship Elementary School is today. That hill was called Agricultural Hill, and the hall was built for the third annual fair and cattle show put on by the Massachusetts Society for Promoting Agriculture. Marchione describes how the hall was used during the annual fair. Weeks before the October fair was due to open, display items would begin arriving at Agricultural Hall. The two-story structure, measuring 70 by 36 feet, stood on beautiful and elevated grounds. Its first floor was used to display the latest farm implements, as well as prize-winning fruits and vegetables, while the upper story accommodated textile and handicraft exhibits. In addition, cattle pens were laid out on either side of the building, where prized livestock were displayed and plowing matches and other competitive activities were held on the nearby slopes of the hill. The fair always began with a procession from Agricultural Hall to the First Church, where the minister invoked God's blessings on the occasion. Awards were then announced by the various committees. In 1829, prizes and premiums were awarded in the following categories: fat cattle, bulls and bull calves, cows and heifers, sheep and swine, inventions, butter and cheese, cider, grain and vegetables, plowing, and manufacturing. A 17-pound turnip, a 19-pound radish, and a bough on which pears hung like a cluster of grapes were among the outstanding exhibits of that year. Later, the building was moved down the hill to Brighton Center, and it was used as the Eastern Market Hotel, used by the many drovers and cattle buyers who frequented the nearby Brighton stockyards. We'll hear much more about in today's main topic.
But first, it's time for this week's upcoming event, a book signing by one of my favorite contemporary historians. Joanne B. Freeman is a professor of American history at Yale, where she's long specialized in teaching the American Revolution. Unlike many academic historians at her level, she's also very visible to the public at large. Her introductory level course on the Revolution is available on YouTube in its entirety, and her razor-sharp wit is on display as she tweets prolifically. As a scholar of Alexander Hamilton, she's attained greater prominence since the musical came out, because she literally wrote the book on dueling that Lin-Manuel used to inform the dueling scenes in the play, while also editing a volume of Hamilton's papers that Miranda took some of the dialogue in the show from. Not only that, she also co-hosts one of my favorite weekly American history podcasts, Backstory Radio. On October 4th, she'll be appearing at the Harvard Coop in Harvard Square to promote her latest book, The Field of Blood. Here's how the event page describes this most recent work. Joanne B. Freeman recovers the long-lost story of physical violence on the floor of the U.S. Congress in The Field of Blood. Drawing on an extraordinary range of sources, she shows that the Capitol was rife with conflict in the decades before the Civil War. Legislative sessions were often punctuated by mortal threats, canings, flipped desks, and all-out slugfests. When debate broke down, congressmen drew pistols and waved Bowie knives. One representative even killed another in a duel. Many were beaten and bullied in an attempt to intimidate them into compliance, particularly on the issue of slavery. These fights didn't happen in a vacuum. Freeman's dramatic accounts of brawls and thrashings tell a larger story of how fisticuffs in journalism and the powerful emotions they elicited raised tensions between North and South and led toward war. In the process, she brings the antebellum Congress to life, revealing its tough realities, the feel, sense, and sound of it, as well as its nation-shaping import. Funny, tragic, and rivetingly told, The Field of Blood offers a front-row view of congressional mayhem and sheds new light on the careers of John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and other luminaries, as well as introducing a host of lesser-known but no less fascinating men. The result is a fresh understanding of the workings of American democracy and the bonds of union on the eve of their greatest peril. The event begins at 7 p.m. on Thursday, October 4th. It's free and tickets aren't required, but given Professor Freeman's recent fame, I would plan on showing up early. The Harvard Coop is located at 1256 Mass Ave in Cambridge. And now it's time for this week's main topic.
What could be a more iconic vision of the Wild West than a cattle drive, perhaps as embodied by John Wayne in the 1948 film Red River?
You're going to Missouri with 10,000 head. I want you all to know what you're up against. We got 1,000 miles to go. 10 miles a day will be good. 15 will be luck.
That movie traces the heyday of cattle drives, as large herds from Texas ranches were driven to railroads in Kansas and Missouri in the years following the Civil War. You might not realize that a generation earlier, cattle drives were already regular features of the Boston area economy, and they all wound up in one place, Brighton, our own little Wild West. When the Brighton stockyards reached their peak in the 1830s and 40s, the term cowboy hadn't really been coined yet. Cattle drives were known as droves, and instead of cowboys, the men who worked them were called drovers. We begin with an article by David C. Smith and Anne E. Bridges in a 1982 issue of the Journal of the Agricultural History Society, titled The Brighton Market, Feeding 19th Century Boston. Droves in New England were relatively small, averaging approximately 200 per drive. Animals were branded or tagged in their ears. On the first day, a half-dozen men with long whips moved the cattle out on the road. For the remainder of the drive, 3 men would be sufficient. Dogs were not often used, even with sheep. A drive from Franklin County, Maine to Brighton usually took about 14 days. Maine was a primary source during many of the market years for beef cattle, sheep, and especially working oxen, milk cows, and animals used for stores. Its place in the beef cattle trade went back a very long time. The first drive south to Boston came as early as 1645. John Mason, one of the first proprietors, immediately began importation of Danish cattle when he began settlement in 1631. Heavy importations occurred through 1633. By 1645, the surplus, some 100 head, were driven south overland and were sold in Boston. This was the beginning of the drover trade. Newspapers were filled with accounts of droves, and persons living in Maine thought passing cattle in sheep droves an item of everyday life. 10 to 15,000 cattle each year were sent to Brighton before the Civil War. Occasionally disasters occurred, but basically, droving was a routine affair, as cattle were rounded up, driven to the nearest marshalling yards, usually at Clinton in central Maine for the majority of years. Some droves, especially of working oxen or young stock for stores, continued to travel overland until late in the century.
A passage in an 1843 edition of the charmingly named Louisville magazine, The Dollar Farmer, a monthly publication of practical and scientific agriculture, describes the scene as drovers from Maine, Vermont, western Massachusetts, and other cattle-raising regions converged on Brighton for the market held every Monday. During nearly the whole day of Monday of each week, the roads leading from Brighton to the neighboring towns are filled by little squads of cattle, sheep, and hogs, which are marched off to the place of execution, where they are dressed for the market, then transported to the city in wagons and placed in the butcher's stalls ready for sale. Even before the herds reached Brighton and the market was convened, drovers and buyers might meet in surrounding suburban communities and reach a deal, as seen in a report on the agriculture of Massachusetts, published in 1841. In times of a quick market, droves of cattle and sheep are often waylaid a day's or more journey from the market, and sales are effected without their reaching Brighton. Large numbers of the droves reach on Saturday night the resting places within such a drive of the market as is easily accomplished on Monday morning. At these places, the Lord's Day is too frequently desecrated by these premature negotiations, and the gathering of the droves towards the market proves many times a troublesome annoyance in the sober part of the community in the vicinity of the great avenues.
The Wild West-style antics of those involved in the cattle trade continued to annoy the sober part of the community, both in the suburbs and in Brighton. Drovers and cattle traders quickly became known for heavy drinking, high-stakes gambling, and occasional crime and violence. That 1841 agricultural report shows what an increasingly temperance-minded community thought of the drovers in their midst. The facilities for intemperance and gambling, which have sometimes existed at Brighton, have been dreadfully prejudicial to the drovers and others who visit there and are obliged to remain there or in the capital for some days, without occupation, for the return of the weight of their cattle. Young men coming from the interior with cattle for sale are often ruined by here being entrapped and laying the foundations of fraud and drunkenness. If there is a place in our community, Brighton is one, where the friends of sobriety should combine their forces in this great cause of order and humanity, and where the banner of total abstinence should throw its broad folds to the breeze. Along with falling victim to the temptation of drink and gambling, drovers could fall victim to real crimes as well. You may be thinking of the cattle rustling we've all seen in westerns, but where is the sense in stealing a herd that you then have to sell, when you can simply wait and steal the money that a drover got for selling the herd instead? Cattle trading was a cash business, and that cash attracted criminals. Smith and Bridges tell the story of one unfortunate cowpoke on the way home from the Brighton market. Drovers often carried large amounts of money and were sometimes the target of attacks. The most significant of these occurred in Waterville, Maine in 1847. A number of stories circulated about this event, but apparently a local doctor actually murdered a drover for his purse of $1,500. A ballad was later written about this.
For the roots of this mini Wild West, we have to go much further back in our nation's history. As Smith and Bridges alluded, cattle drives have been coming to the Boston area since the 1600s, but the livestock trade began to center on Brighton during the Revolutionary War. After the battles at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, militia units from around New England streamed into Cambridge and Roxbury to keep the British regulars trapped in the peninsular town of Boston. This sudden influx of hungry soldiers dramatically increased the demand for food and supplies beyond what local farmers could provide. In the community known then as Little Cambridge, an entrepreneurial family named Winship recognized the opportunity that was at hand. Longtime Brighton-Alston historian William Marchione introduces them. The Winships, who originally hailed from Lexington, settled in Brighton just before the outbreak of the American Revolution. Cambridge, of course, served as the headquarters of the Continental Army in the 1775 to 1776 period, and General Washington's troops badly needed provisions. Jonathan Winship Sr. and Jonathan Winship II, father and son, responded by putting out a call to the farmers of Middlesex County and other outlying areas to send their cattle to Little Cambridge. As this livestock arrived, the Winships purchased and processed it for the army. The importance of the Winship contribution to the Patriot cause was noted by Willard M. Wallace in his Military History of the Revolution. There were so few hungry soldiers in the siege lines around Boston that winter that one might say it was with food, rather than with troops and arms, that Washington kept the British locked up in the city. The Brighton cattle market continued to prosper after the war. By 1790, Jonathan Winship II had become the largest meat packer in Massachusetts, putting up some 5,000 barrels of beef a year for foreign markets alone. When Cambridge's town government failed to repair the Great Bridge that linked Little Cambridge to Harvard Square and points north, and made other decisions that threatened the well-being of the local cattle industry, the residents of Little Cambridge resolved to secede from the parent town. They won legislative approval of separation in 1807, choosing the name Brighton for the new corporate entity.
Over the next 2 decades, the newly independent town of Brighton slowly built up its infrastructure to support the cattle and livestock trade. As Boston grew and other markets served by the Brighton stockyards grew, the facilities to house livestock and the people involved in their trade had to grow as well. Smith and Bridges pick up the tale. On October 8, 1816, the Massachusetts Society for Promoting Agriculture held its first annual cattle show at the market site. By 1818, the shows were successful enough for a hall to be erected at the market on land donated by the Winship family, who were still in control of the market. Soon, a hotel, called the Cattle Fair Hotel, was built and began business at the market square. Behind the hotel, stockyard pens were built stretching parallel to Main Street. These yards, the hotel lobby, and Main Street were the central market until the hotel was raised in 1850. Some attempt was made in 1831 to 32 to hold the sales at the fairgrounds as well as at the hotel square, but this was not very successful, and the hotel continued to be a major focus of activity. Founded in 1830, the Cattle Fair Hotel Corporation was the second corporation established in Massachusetts. The company was a large landholder in Brighton and owned two assets vital to the cattle trade in New England. The first were the Brighton stockyards themselves. The second was the large hotel, located between today's Market and Leicester Streets, that catered to the farmers, drovers, buyers, and other wheelers and dealers that came to the market. As described by William Marchione, the Cattle Fair Hotel, with its 100 rooms, grand ballroom, and great dining room, was the largest hotel in the Boston suburbs. The hotel's manager in the early 1830s, Zachariah B. Porter, later founded the Porter House Hotel in Cambridge, from which Porter Square and the Porter House Steak derived their names. Bostonians rode out along the Mill Dam Road, now Beacon Street, and Mill Dam Extension, Lower Commonwealth Avenue, to the cattle fair to avail themselves of the liquid refreshments available in its giant saloon, which was said to be the largest watering hole in New England.
Of course, cattle weren't the only livestock being bought and sold at the cattle fair in Brighton. There were also pigs, sheep, and poultry, all of which were also driven to Brighton on foot. Smith and Bridges introduce us to some of these other herds. Driving sheep was similar to driving cattle, although fewer people were needed to do the work. After about a day, sheep moved steadily, stopping to eat by the verge when they wished, then falling into line behind others who had walked along. Sheep droves were larger. 600 to 1,000 were often moved in a drove. Poultry was also sold at Brighton. Killed eviscerated birds, ducks, geese, chicken, and turkeys, were crammed into barrels and covered with salt. These birds were sold in the fall, especially as Thanksgiving became a significant holiday after mid-century. Drovers experimented with droves of live birds. Reports of turkey drives from Vermont and Maine are accurate, although the numbers of animals is unknown. Peter Gilbert of Vermont Public Radio describes how a mid-19th century turkey drive would have worked. Before railroads, the only way to get turkeys from Vermont to market in Boston was to walk them there. And that, throughout much of the 19th century, is exactly what Vermonters did, including Vermonters from the northernmost parts of the state. Townspeople put their birds of a feather together, and, accompanied by wagons with camp supplies and tons of feed grain, they escorted as many as 7,000 birds at a time all the way to Boston. Drives of 3,000 to 4,000 birds were common in the 1820s and 30s. Historian Charles Morrow Wilson says that about 1,000 birds was the minimum necessary to make the 150 to 350-mile trek worthwhile. It was a long haul. The flocks could only make 10 to 12 miles a day, and at least one drover was required for each 100 birds. Boys scattered shelled corn feed in front of the birds so they would walk forward, while others herded from behind. Flocks might spread out for more than a mile, ranging in width from a few feet to 50 yards. To protect the birds' feet on such a long hike over rough terrain and November's frozen ground, Vermonters sometimes coated the birds' feet with warm tar. They lost about 10% of the turkeys to forded rivers, foxes, hungry farm families they met en route, and other perils of the journey.
Whether they were driving cattle or sheep or even turkeys, drovers who brought their herds to Brighton in the 1830s and 40s were arriving at the peak of the market's popularity. It was an era when local populations were booming, demand for meat was high, and railroads were just beginning to have an impact. Refrigeration, which would eventually allow meat to be processed near where it was raised rather than where it was consumed, was still decades in the future. Market Day in Brighton was such a large to-do that it could be nationwide news. Even in the fruitful agricultural region of Kentucky, the Louisville dollar farmer looked to Brighton as a possible model to emulate. The Brighton Cattle Fair. When we were in Boston last summer, we requested a friend to give us an account of the manner of conducting of the cattle fair at Brighton, thinking that perhaps there might be something in it worthy of imitation in our western cities. We have received the following, which will be found interesting. We trust that a fair of this kind will be established in this neighborhood. The 1841 Agricultural Report gives us the lay of the land. The great cattle fair of the state, and indeed of New England, is held at the beautiful village of Brighton, about 6 miles from Boston, on the Monday of every week. Here, capacious pens are erected for the reception of such livestock as may be brought in, and the drovers and butchers assemble from all directions. The business of selling and buying is principally got through with on Monday, though cattle and other stock, when prices are not satisfactory to the seller, are frequently kept over for a week or fortnight for a better market. With the exception of a small fair at Danvers in Essex County, held occasionally in the fall, I know of no other cattle fair in New England.
It must have been an eye-opening experience for a farmer or drover from some far-off rural corner of New England to come into Brighton on market day. Suddenly they would find themselves in a bustling urban center, one that was free of the puritanical sensibilities of the Brahmin elite and its nearby neighbor, and one that was swollen far beyond its usual population with fellow traders. There were saloons to visit and cards to play, and of course cutthroat wheeling and dealing to engage in to get a fair price for your stock. In an 1841 notebook that he kept while living at the Brook Farm Agrarian Commune in West Roxbury, Nathaniel Hawthorne described his experience at the Brighton Cattle Fair. On arriving at Brighton, we found the village thronged with people, horses, and vehicles. Probably there is no place in New England where the character of an agricultural population may be so well studied. Almost all the farmers within a reasonable distance make it a point, I suppose, to attend Brighton Fair pretty frequently, if not on business, yet as amateurs. Then there are all the cattle people and butchers who supply the Boston market, and dealers from far and near, and every man who has a cow or yoke of oxen, whether to sell or buy, goes to Brighton on Monday. Most of the people were of a bulky make, with much bone and muscle, and some good store of fat, as if they had lived on flesh diet, with mottled faces too, hard and red, like those of persons who adhered to the old fashion of spirit drinking. Great round-paunched country squires were there too, sitting under the porch of the tavern, or waddling about, whip in hand, discussing the points of the cattle. There were also gentlemen farmers, neatly, trimly, and fashionably dressed in handsome trousers strapped under their boots. Yeomen, too, in their black or blue Sunday suits, cut by country tailors and awkwardly worn. Others, like myself, had on the blue stuff frocks which they wear in the fields, the most comfortable garments that ever were invented. Country loafers were among the throng, men who looked wistfully at the liquors in the bar and waited for some friend to invite them to drink. Poor, shabby, out-at-elbow devils. Also, dandies from the city, corseted and buckramed, who had come to see the humors of Brighton Fair. All these, and other varieties of mankind, either thronged the spacious barroom of the hotel, drinking, smoking, talking, bargaining, or walked about among the cattle pens.
The Louisville dollar farmer describes what those pens would have been like and how the drovers put them to use. You may remember that, in coming from Cushing's Garden last summer, we passed through Brighton, and I pointed out to you the Cattle Fair Hotel and the pens adjacent thereto. This hotel and the pens belong to a company who leased the hotel and grounds, and drovers, coming in to market their cattle, are allowed the use of the pens for the purpose of disposing of their cattle. There is no system about the matter except what is observed at a barber's shop of first come, first served as to the use of the pens. The cattle are generally driven into the immediate neighborhood on Saturday or Sunday, and on Sunday evening, or very early on Monday morning, The cattle are placed in the pens, where they remain until they are disposed of, which is usually during Monday afternoon. That 1841 agricultural report gives an idea of the scale of a single market day in Brighton. The number of head of cattle of all descriptions brought here frequently exceeds 8,000 on a market day. 5,000 sheep have sometimes been driven there in a single day. And then an 1846 edition of the New England Farmer magazine picks up the tale. The cattle, sheep, and hogs which change hands at the weekly Brighton Fair are scattered in every direction to supply the vast market which is furnished by the thickly populated region within 50 miles of Boston. About 200 head of beef cattle are purchased every week by dealers or cattle brokers from New Bedford, Taunton, and Fall River, whither they are driven to supply the butchers of those places and their neighborhoods. As many more, perhaps, go to Lowell, Salem, Danvers, and other neighborhoods are supplied in the same manner. About 500 are slaughtered weekly in Brighton, or 25,000 a year for the Boston market.
Beef was the main focus of the Brighton Cattle Fair, and one of the staple foods in Boston and throughout New England. It was not, however, the only product up for sale on a typical day in Brighton. That 1841 report describes all the different types of cattle that were offered for sale. The cattle principally consist of young stock for wintering, working oxen, milk cows with their calves, and fat cattle for barreling, and for the retail market in the city and vicinity. Then Smith and Bridges described the various fates of these different classifications of bovines after they were sold. Beef cattle were slaughtered for table use. Older, tougher animals were sold for barreling cattle or mess beef. Beef appeared the year around, with a season for barreling cattle running from mid-August to mid-November. Fancy or Christmas cattle were sold in December. Farmers divested themselves of excess and surplus animals in the fall. Yearlings, 2- and 3-year-olds, or young stock, were brought in great numbers to Brighton where they were sold as stores cattle. These stores cattle were not slaughtered, but were driven to western Massachusetts or to the Connecticut Valley, where they were fed all winter, often stall-fed in fact, and then returned to Brighton for sale and slaughter in the spring. The stores cattle season usually began the last week in August and was finished by Christmas. Working oxen, sold in pairs or yokes, were offered throughout the year. The peak season occurred after the lumbering season was over in Maine, as farmers sought good, strong, well-broken animals for their work. These animals were often resold at Brighton in September and October for work in the lumber woods again. The numbers of oxen tended to diminish after the Civil War as horses and machinery replaced them, but they were still being auctioned in small numbers into the 20th century. Drovers rented pens from the proprietors who were, for a long time, the Winship family. The animals were driven to the central auction site near the hotel, then to the scales, and finally to pens of their purchasers or to the slaughterhouse. All this was done with relative ease, although contemporary accounts stress the dust and the noise. Sales, beginning at 9 o'clock, were terminated at noon when a large bell was struck, then commenced again at 1, and were ordinarily finished at 4.
The Louisville Dollar Farmer describes how a sale would have been made at the Brighton market. The butchers from Boston, New Bedford, and the large towns in this vicinity meet the drovers at this hotel and dicker with each other for beef, pork, or mutton in their own way. Some selling their cattle by the head, some by gross weight, and some by net weight. And in the latter case, the butcher drives off his cattle after making the price and takes them to his slaughterhouse, which may be 5, 10, or 50 miles distant, and, in a day or two, meets the drover at some place agreed upon, generally at some hotel in Boston, and brings with him on a slip of paper the net weight of the cattle and pays the money as agreed upon at Brighton. The drover relying upon the honesty of the butcher for the weight of his cattle, and I am told that it has scarcely, if ever, been known that any dispute or difficulty arises in consequence of this mode of dealing. The 1841 report on Massachusetts agriculture reiterates this downtime that drovers had while waiting to get paid, but casts some doubt on the claim that there were scarcely any disputes or difficulties because of the practice. The drover generally waits for 2 or 3 days until he gets the returned weight of his cattle after being slaughtered and receives his money.
Not only did this waiting period give a hard-working drover time to be tempted by the sins of drink and gambling, it also gave them an opportunity to be cheated by fraudulent buyers, as the report continues. It is extremely desirable that the system of buying and selling by live weight or on the hoof should be adopted at Brighton. It would be greatly to the advantage of the drovers both in respect to interest and morals to be able to finish their business in one day, receive their money on the sale of their cattle, and return immediately to their homes. It would prevent the suspicion of fraud which now sometimes exists in the returns of weight made by slaughterers, by removing all opportunity for it. I may mention an occurrence which shows the boldness with which these frauds are sometimes committed, and the extraordinary circumstances by which, in many cases, crimes, when deemed most safely covered up, are detected. A farmer, on receiving the returns of the weight of a yoke of oxen, which he had entrusted to a drover for sale, was very much disappointed and dissatisfied. He had no reason to distrust the honor of the drover, and the drover returned the weight of the full number of cattle sold. It seems after the drover had delivered his herd of cattle to the purchaser selected this yoke of cattle and, instead of killing them, sold them at a high price, putting another inferior pair in their stead, whose weight on being killed was returned to the drover. In the meantime, the yoke in question, which were sold to a farmer, broke out of his yard and returned to their first owner, which led to the discovery of the fraud. We call ourselves a Christian community. In Turkey, such rascalities would speedily give the villain an opportunity of carrying his head under his arm.
The Brighton Cattle Fair had been founded in the days before railroads, but as it was reaching its peak, the railroads were being built out at the same time. The first railroads were built in Boston in the mid-1830s, and by 1834, the Boston and Worcester Railroad had a rail yard in Brighton. In the decades before refrigeration, this simply meant that the market could expand, as more cattle could be brought in from further afield without the delays and expense involved in driving them overland. Still, cattle drives and rail freight happily coexisted for a long time, as described in the New England Farmer in 1846, once rail lines were well established. The cattle are brought from various sections, some of them from a great distance, from Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and the western counties of this state, western New York, and even Ohio. Many are yet driven in the old way, but many more are transported by railroad. Cattle are now brought by railroad a distance of 200 miles in 24 hours. This distance, if they were driven, could not have been accomplished in less than a fortnight. Smith and Bridges, in their article in the Journal of the Agricultural History Society, describe how the growth of railroads enabled competing cattle markets to spring up in neighboring communities, yet overland cattle drives kept the Brighton cattle markets alive and well for nearly a century. By 1831 to 33, the market area had expanded away from the hotel somewhat as the trade grew. When the Fitchburg Railroad was built, a small subsidiary market grew up in Cambridge. Some animals were sold when they left the trains, but most were driven the short distance to Brighton for disposition. In the 1870s, a large Union stockyard was erected in Watertown, and many felt that the Brighton market would come to an end. Increasingly, sheep were sold on commission lots at Watertown, as were western cattle. Brighton, however, continued to be the center of the trade as overland driving persisted throughout the 19th century. Apparently, the last land drives occurred at the market about 1910. They describe how, in the end, the railroad was incorporated into the standard business model at the Brighton Cattle Fair, allowing it to continue as an important part of the local economy well into the 20th century. Railroads at first took mostly fat cattle, while thinner cattle, store cattle, oxen, and young stock were driven overland. By 1852, more and more cattle moved by rail, however, and the percentage increased steadily. The numbers of railroad cars arriving at Brighton each week from all sources ranged from 170 to 200 by 1860. Some large shippers, such as Lambert Hastings, St. Johnsbury, Vermont, who began as a drover, shifted to the railroad entirely by 1855. He averaged over 15 carloads a week to Boston for the next 15 years. With the road schedules well known, a drover could leave Boston on Sunday, go to Maine or Vermont, purchase cattle, drive them to the depot, return with the drove to Boston, sell the animals, and be ready to leave the next Sunday to do it again. Drovers' cars remained a feature of Boston trains until about 1930. A drove of cattle overland through a town now brought much newspaper comment, as the railroads completely dominated the traffic.
Of course, we haven't really touched on the uses for all those cows that were being driven into Brighton in the 19th century. A quick warning, the next few minutes will involve descriptions of the slaughtering and meatpacking industries and related businesses. We'll try not to be too graphic, but if you're sensitive to that sort of thing, you may want to skip forward just a few minutes. The number of slaughterhouses and related establishments grew steadily throughout the middle decades of the 19th century. By the 1860s, there were 50 to 60 slaughterhouses scattered around the town of Brighton. The 1841 agricultural report starts the accounting for all these slaughterhouses with the barreling operations. Barreling referred to the process of preserving salted meat in barrels for long-term storage. The cattle for barreling are taken at once to the large slaughtering and packing establishments, where they are disposed of accordingly. And fat cattle are likewise purchased for the butchers by the slaughterers, who kill and dress for $1 per head with the customary perquisites, or else purchase and kill on their own account and supply the marketmen in the city and vicinity with such beef and with such amounts of beef as they may desire. The dollar farmer expands that description, including some of the ancillary businesses that sprang up around the beef industry. The season for packing beef and pork has now commenced, and Brighton Village, on Monday mornings, presents a lively scene. There are several large packing establishments in Cambridge and Brighton where beef and pork are put up for the use of the Navy, for shipment, and for general sale. The same establishments frequently render the tallow, make candles and soap, and sell the bones or ship them to Europe. Near Day's Rope Works in Roxbury is a perfect Golgotha, where beef is jerked and the bones and heads are piled up like the Egyptian pyramids, waiting for shipment, or, which sometimes happens, to be ground up for manure.
Unlike at other major cattle markets in the U.S., at Brighton, the weight of the discarded parts of the cow counted toward the market weight. In other markets, the head, feet, hide, and entrails would be discarded before the resulting carcass was weighed and the farmer was paid. However, in Brighton, those parts were considered a fifth quarter of beef. The slaughterhouse retained the rights to them, and they were sold for industrial uses, as the 1841 Report on Agriculture in Massachusetts details. In Brighton Market, the offal, or perquisites of the slaughterhouse, are the entrails, the feet, the head, a strip from the foreshin, and the blood. The tongue, cheeks, and heart of the bollock go to the butcher. The slaughterer sells the feet and head to the tallow chandler and soap boiler, who extracts the tallow and oil. The claws go to the comb maker. The bones and pith of the horns go to the bone mill for manure, or for the purpose of obtaining animal charcoal, and the blood to the sugar refineries. A thorough system of economy pervades in all of the branches of the business. After over 40 years of stable operations, 3 momentous changes rocked the Brighton cattle market in 1872 and 73. First, the dozens of slaughterhouses and butchers scattered around the stockyards and across Brighton were consolidated into a single modern facility. Then, the introduction of refrigerated train cars began changing how beef was produced and consumed around the country. And then, finally, the independent town of Brighton was annexed to the rapidly expanding city of Boston. Even with the rise of the railroads and competing cattle markets, Smith and Bridges describe how the Brighton Cattle Fair continued to grow throughout the 1850s and 60s. As the number of animals increased, the auction day was moved to Wednesday, then expanded to Tuesday for wholesale purchases, and finally was moved to Friday. By 1860, however, some sales were being held on every day of the week. In the busiest time in autumn, many butchers met droves outside Brighton to deflect the traffic to other towns, and in order to effect sharp price differentiations with their competitors.
During this period of growth, landowners in Brighton saw another opportunity to turn a profit. Trains and streetcars now allowed people who worked within the city of Boston to make their homes outside. Suburbs from Brookline to Dedham were growing rapidly as these displaced urbanites bought house lots and built country homes close to the transit lines that could carry them to work. Brighton landowners wanted in on the action, but the filth and stench created by the dozens of slaughterhouses in downtown Brighton made attracting suburban homebuyers a tough sell. At the same time, state legislators were suddenly preoccupied with the sanitary practices of the meat industry. An 1870 report on Boston area slaughtering said, "During the past year, 53,000 beeves, 342,000 sheep, and 144,000 hogs were slaughtered within 6 miles of Faneuil Hall." While the population within this circle of towns and cities has been every year growing more dense, requiring not only increased supplies of meat, but increased precautions for the maintenance of health. The vacant and waste places where offensive trades established themselves long ago are now being rapidly filled by a busy population whose need of wholesome air is urgent. Practices in themselves objectionable may be permitted where there is plenty of fresh air. The situation in Brighton, where most of the slaughterhouses serving Boston were located, was a clear affront to popular and scientific opinion about the dangers from water and air polluted by decomposing animal offal. Local butchers had taken no steps to dispose of waste matter properly or to dispel offensive odors. The situation was surely leading to disastrous consequences that would inevitably result in lowered resistance to disease and premature death. The attempt of the state board to translate advice into action met with resistance at first. Directives of the legislature had been thwarted by opposition from the butchers. In 1871, however, the board was given the power to enforce its recommendations and to close slaughterhouses which were found to operate in such a way as to endanger the public health. Moving with caution, the state board called a meeting of the Brighton butchers to inform them of the need to improve slaughtering conditions and stressed the hope that they would establish a new abattoir without further legal restraints. All through the year, individual establishments, particularly the largest and most influential, continued to oppose regulation.
So in 1872, a new ordinance forced all of the slaughterhouses to consolidate into a single, new, modern, high-tech facility, as Smith and Bridges describe. In 1872, a new abattoir was built at Brighton on the Charles River so that vessels could bring animals direct to the slaughterhouse. The new buildings, 4 stories high, were able to handle 300 beef cattle each day. After slaughter, the meat was hung for 2 or 3 days in a cold room, where temperature was lowered by the installation of a dropped ceiling shielding 15 to 20 tons of ice, through which air was circulated by a series of ducts. In the slaughtering area, hides and offal were dropped through trapdoors to cars, which moved on tracks to dispose of their contents. Here was located the rendering house, which conducted its business by steam heat under pressure. Odor was virtually eliminated. In other areas of the building, the parts of the slaughtered animals were carried to their destinations by a series of pulleys and shafts, so the amount of physical work was diminished substantially. The ice for the cool rooms was transferred in the same way. This abattoir remained in use until the 1880s, when new chemically refrigerated plants were constructed. Just a few months later, another technological advance was introduced into the livestock industry. Though the impact of this one took longer to be felt, in the end, it would completely transform the meat business. In March of 1873, refrigerator cars were mentioned for the first time in the market reports, and in the next week, the price of dressed beef began to be quoted regularly in Brighton. That simple sentence from the journal article by Smith and Bridges belies how much refrigeration changed this business. For decades, the cattle industry had been growing in Texas and on the northern Great Plains, but the cattle were shipped to markets in Chicago, or back east to Brighton, Albany, and New York City. Before refrigeration, stock had to be slaughtered and meat had to be packed close to the hungry cities that would consume it. After refrigeration, the model was turned on its head. Suddenly, it made economic sense to slaughter cattle near where they were raised and ship the refrigerated meat back east to be purchased and eaten. Though it would be nearly a century before the Brighton stockyards fully closed, this 1873 technological advance struck their death knell.
Back in episode 61, we talked about how Boston grew through the late 19th and early 20th centuries by annexing its neighbors. William Marchione explains how the Brighton cattle yards and the debate around annexation were intertwined. Urbanization was slowed by the large numbers of drovers, cattle dealers, country farmers, and itinerant merchants who poured into the town each week to attend the cattle market. The town contained some 15 hotels for the accommodation of this transient element. Hotels equipped with bars that dispensed as much liquor as the patrons cared to pay for, that tolerated disorderly and drunken behavior, and that furnished a haven for high-stakes gambling. The poor condition of the town's roads, its lack of street lighting, and an almost complete absence of sewers also militated against suburban development. Believing that there was little point in investing the town's resources in roads over which droves of cattle were regularly driven, the town fathers spent very little money on highways. They also declined to invest in sewers, which might tend to undermine the freewheeling dumping practices upon which the slaughterhouse proprietors relied. The transformation of Brighton from an industrial town to commuter suburb was accomplished in 3 broad steps between 1870 and 1873. First, the town's slaughterhouses were closed down, and its butchers forced into the abattoir, thus opening previously fouled acreage to suburban development. Then a massive public works program was inaugurated with the object of making Brighton more attractive to would-be commuters. In the 4 years leading up to the annexation vote, Brighton spent some $500,000 on improved roads, curbings, sidewalks, sewers, and street lighting. Additional sums were also spent on public facility improvements, including a new public library, a handsome grammar school, and several new firehouses. The impact of this orgy of spending on the town's financing was intentionally staggering. Brighton's income in the 4 years under consideration totaled only $438,000, but its spending level reached an incredible $1.56 million, 4 times what it received. The difference could be made up only one way, by heavy borrowing. In the 1870 to 1873 period, Brighton's town debt increased by 800%. If Brighton had remained an independent town after 1873, its residents would have been obliged to pay substantially higher taxes. Members of the Brighton business elite, meanwhile, filed the legislation that authorized Brighton's annexation to Boston. In building the town's huge indebtedness, they laid the groundwork for the annexation decision of October 7, 1873. Allow Boston to annex Brighton, they advised the townspeople, and the metropolis would automatically absorb its potentially crippling debt.
After joining the great city of Boston in 1874, the stockyards kept cranking on. They moved to North Beacon in 1884 to open up more land for development and continued there, pretty much where New Balance is today, in a steady state of slow decline until 1967. Smith and Bridges give a sense of how those last decades went. The market itself was a stable force in New England life. The butchers and others associated with the market adjusted to different animals and different sources of supply with little difficulty. The method of preserving meat for the consumer remained relatively the same, speedy salting or pickling, until the coming of refrigeration. Texas cattle marked the beginning of the end for New England stock raisers, and refrigeration struck the death blow. Eventually, those new factors in the market eliminated the market itself, but not until well into the 20th century. In the final decades, the stockyards were plagued by accidents, large and small. There were fires in 1895, 1910, and 1912. After the 4-alarm fire in 1910, the Boston Daily Globe headline read, "Steers run wild in the streets and impede work of firemen." Large numbers of the cattle, which were released in the effort to drive them away from the burning stockyards, stampeded and ran wildly through the streets of the vicinity, bellowing madly and endangering the lives of the crowds of people in the streets watching the fire. Many of the terror-stricken cattle rushed madly into the flames and were roasted on the hoof. The steers running around the fire endangered the lives of the firemen who were working desperately to extinguish the flames. Cattle probably ran wild in the streets of Brighton all the time when it was Boston's own Wild West, but now that it was a densely developed neighborhood, incidents like this were a problem. And they didn't stop. In 1924, the Globe headline read, "6 steers go into the river, rescued from the Charles at Brighton Abattoir. Another animal flees over bridge into Watertown, killed by 2 rifle shots as he charges police car." 7 steers, just arrived from the west, averaging 1,500 pounds each, made a sensational break for freedom as they were being unloaded from cattle cars on the Brighton Abattoir grounds. 6 of the steers took a shortcut to freedom across the Charles River, and their combined weight caused them to crash through the ice. They were nearly drowned, but were finally rescued after 20 minutes hard work by officers of the Brighton station of the Metropolitan District Police, assisted by abattoir men and others. The 7th steer dashed along the bank to the further end of the abattoir grounds, crossed North Beacon Street Bridge, and escaped into Watertown, where he was cornered in some bushes and killed by 2 rifle shots fired by Sergeant Dominic O'Connor of the Metropolitan Police.
Until they were forced to start using trucks well into the 20th century, cattle were driven through the streets from the stockyards to the abattoir. Most of the time this was fine, but it occasionally led to what John Wayne might have called a stampede. The Boston police were called in on escaped cattle at least 5 times between 1936 and 1954. The Division 14 police station in Brighton kept special heavier shot shells in inventory to load their shotguns with when these escapes happened. D14 referred to the file noting instances where animals were shot as the cowboy files. An escape in 1954 led to a lawsuit against the stockyards that was still winding its way through the courts in 1962. In that case, a single cow escaped from an unfenced loading dock. By the time the farmer realized what had happened, the cow had a head start. It made it about a quarter of a mile with the farmer pursuing in his truck, before running into a worksite where a Boston Edison substation was being built and badly goring a construction worker. As the lawsuit brought by the worker's widow states, the cow was thereafter pursued by the police and shot. While that case was in process, the stockyards ran into an implacable force more powerful than fire, or even cattle stampeding through the city streets. In 1956, the unstoppable force of development in Boston came calling for the Brighton stockyards. That year, the Metropolitan District Commission voted to take most of the remaining land occupied by the stockyards in order to extend Soldiers Field Road and build the exit ramps connecting Soldiers Field to Market Street and Western Avenue. The remainder of the land taken was to be used for industrial development.
Farmers opposed the measure, with the Globe reporting, a bill aimed at keeping slaughtering facilities on the area now occupied by firms in the Brighton Abattoir was strongly supported by farmers and farm organizations yesterday. Elimination of the Brighton Abattoir would definitely lead to the elimination of Brighton stockyards, which is the current price-setting market in New England, the Massachusetts Farm Bureau Federation stated. Their efforts were unsuccessful. In the end, Boston's Wild West came to an end, not with a bang, but with a whimper. A much-reduced stockyard operation limped along in Brighton until 1967, when it closed and moved to Littleton, Massachusetts, becoming the Farmers Live Animal Market Exchange. It is now the last livestock market in the state.
To learn more about the Wild West years in Brighton, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/099. We'll have links to that excellent journal article on the Brighton stockyards by Smith and Bridges, the 1841 report on agriculture in Massachusetts, and Nathaniel Hawthorne's impressions of the Brighton market, as well as all the contemporary periodicals we quoted. We'll also link to several articles by Alston Brighton historian William Marchione, to whom we owe a great debt for inspiring this episode and conducting exhaustive research on the beef industry in Brighton. And of course, we'll have links to information about this week's featured historic site and upcoming event.
If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at podcast@hubhistory.com. You can call and leave a voicemail at 617-383-9255, and we might play it on the show. We're Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Or you can go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please think about writing us a brief review. It's still the best way to help others discover the show.
That's all for now. We'll be back next time to talk about the 250th anniversary of the British occupation of Boston with author J.L. Bell.